Why, hello there, and welcome to another episode of the Innovantage Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Max, and it is my ongoing duty and job to bring you insights from the world of business and tech. And here at Innovantage, where business meets tech, to bring you your competitive edge. To help me on my journey today, I am joined by a very special person, a wonderful person, Mr. Michael Dowden. Michael has over 30 years of experience with serverless technologies, and he is an expert when it comes to serverless technologies. And today we will be talking, you will never guess, about serverless technologies. So, Michael, hi, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you so much. Happy to be here. I
Can you tell us a
feel
little
like I
bit
need
what?
to clarify. I have 30 years experience in the industry, but serverless hasn't been around for quite that long. So about
Yeah,
15 years there.
I felt weird saying it immediately, but then again, for the purposes of being natural, that drives engagements of the YouTube overlords. So we'll just live that, and
Absolutely.
hopefully it will perform better. But yeah, I felt awkward immediately while saying it. So tell us
That's all good.
how did those 15 years with serverless handle, and 15 years before?
So it's been a really interesting journey, and I kind of stumbled into serverless technology accidentally.
Hmm.
I didn't really set out to work that way. It was really a matter of working for some startups and looking for options that would be cost effective, that would scale as we grew, that would be available to us. And I just kind of started finding things that were out there. So we started with Google App Engine, started finding designing some solutions for that, and then later I was working on another startup and found Firebase, the real time database,
Hmm.
and that became our very first platform for that app. It just happened accidentally because the way that I have approached software for a long time is usually front to back. So I work on the user facing side of things. I do the UX piece. I try to, and especially when I'm working with a startup, what's one of the first things you want to do? You want to prove the concept. So I'm trying to get things out in front of customers, do user studies, that sort of thing, and get to the point where we know that we have a product that the users are going to be able to figure out how to use, how are going to be able to connect with, and that it's going to solve their problem. So one of the startups I was working with, FlexiPark, which I still operate as a parking company here, and we literally did all of this stuff, got it figured out, and then okay, now we need a backend for this because the whole thing was just sitting in a browser on a client device as a progressive web application. Didn't set out to make it serverless; it just became serverless because that's what made sense as we were growing and designing the thing.
So I feel like that's a very nice juncture to talk about what serverless even is, especially for the layman. That just sounds
Yep.
a little bit, hard to grasp.
Sure. So the core concept of serverless is that it's obviously doesn't mean that there are no servers, right? The servers are still there. They're still being operated by someone. The idea of serverless is that it is at least a second level abstraction on those servers. So if you think about you have a server, you have a virtual machine, maybe then you have an infrastructure as a service managing all that stuff for you. And you have a platform as a service that is making individual um, logical services available to you. Serverless is the next step. It is only providing the base level operating containers you need to do your work. So serverless, one of the core concepts in serverless is functions as a service. In this case, it's kind of like microservices where every single function is managed and scaled individually. So with functions as a service, I can build a functional unit of code. I can deploy that. I can deploy that separately from everything else. I can deploy that together with other functions. And those are going to scale separately. They're going to be managed separately. And that is a way that we can grow. So because they can scale separately, one of the things that can happen with a function that's been deployed is my traffic spikes. I get I go from having 10 users a minute to 1,000 users a minute. What happens is the infrastructure, the serverless provider will scale up and will generate additional copies of that function so that we can handle that additional traffic. When the traffic goes away, so do the functions. So one of the core concepts of serverless is that the platform will scale to meet the traffic that you have. It also will charge you only for the actual computer time that you use,
Mhm.
and you don't have to manage it. Those are some of the
That's
kind of the core fundamentals of what defines serverless.
okay. So that makes sense. You're basically outsourcing a part of your infrastructure to make it lighter, leaner, more responsive, better in every feasible possible way, right? But I'm guessing there are some downsides to this approach as well.
Yeah, there's always downsides. There's a lot of upsides. The downside happens when you need something to happen in a very specific way at a very low level on the system, right?
Mhm.
Because I don't have access to the low level on the system. I can, depending upon if I'm on GCP or AWS or Azure, I can choose how much memory to allow the functions to have. I can choose a number of other types of parameters. But the other thing that can happen sometimes is I lose some of the visibility to what's going on with the scaling. So I mentioned you don't know how many functions are running at a given moment in time, to because you have deployed a unit of code, but you don't know how many instances of that live in the wild at any given moment in time necessarily. Maybe they're providing visibility to that, maybe they're not. And you don't necessarily control how quickly those are going to spin up or what those thresholds are. Now, as time has gone on, we've gotten more and more and more configuration options to where we can fine tune some of these things, like how quickly it spins up. One of the things that happens in functions spinning up is the concept of a cold start, because effectively to launch that function, it's spinning up. Generally, it's going to be something like a Docker container. It's got to spin up any runtimes that need to happen. And that takes time. It can take maybe a couple seconds. So there can be a lag between when the demand hits and when the functions are available to serve that. And so during that ramp up period, there can be a little bit of a lag that is noticeable to the users. That's one of the types of downsides. So observability becomes a big challenge when you have a large scale infrastructure that's serverless, because again, we don't have direct access to those services anymore. So we need to use observability tools that run in our code to kind of keep track of that or run in the infrastructure. We need to be able to see what's going on and really get a good understanding, because if we end up in a situation where there's a bug or an issue because of how quickly functions spin up, for example, or because of any sort of parallel processing problems that happen behind the scenes, now I don't have a great way of finding that unless I'm running some sort of observability tool. Um, and there can be other types of issues, like serverless is really, really great for small, individually managed units of code. If you have really, really, really long running services, a lot of times serverless is capped out. A lot of serverless functions, you can't run more than 5 minutes.
Mm.
Anything that needs to run longer than that, then serverless is not a great option. Maybe you have really, really low latency requirements. I'm thinking about, um, I don't know, trading. A lot of trading applications. There's a lot of low, maybe hardware application. You need super low latency. You need things to happen super fast. That may not be serverless. Serverless has massive capacity, but there can be a little bit of latency getting to the point where you have the capacity that you wanted to serve. So it's really important, as with anything, that you carefully consider your use case and what is right for you. Now, something that I advocate a lot with serverless, and this has become a thing for me for a number of years, is I really believe that most companies, most projects should be serverless first. And by this,
Mm.
I mean when you don't know what to do, or when you don't know your application yet, when you are just starting out with a new project, it should be serverless. That should be your default opinion. And you should build it serverless, and only When you understand why serverless isn't a good option, and usually not for the entire project, usually for some small piece of it, that's when you should go through and design a different type of architecture for that area of your project. And there's a lot of reasons that I advocate for this. One of them is that you can usually build faster with serverless because you're doing less setup and spin up of infrastructure, right? So it helps you get something up and running quicker. Serverless scales automatically. So if you get successful or if you have a lot of traffic and things happening while you're building and deploying this thing, cool. You can just handle that for the most part. I mean, there's caveats always, but in general, you're going to be much more ready to handle unexpected spikes and uneven traffic if you went in serverless from the get-go. And so now, by using the serverless first approach, you have built the thing, you have it in front of customers, you're able to handle the traffic, and now that gives you the time you need to learn what's working well, what's not working well, what are the things that I need to do differently. Very famously, I don't remember if it was earlier this year or late last year, Amazon, who's famous for their serverless infrastructure, on the video service, published an article talking about how they stopped using serverless for one component of that video streaming service. And that article was taken so out of context by so many people, and everybody had to get in and put their 2 cents in, that they ended up retracting the article, despite the fact it was a really great technical write-up of the fact that they had been serverless. They decided that this one specific area of the project had demands that their service infrastructure couldn't meet. They re-architected just that piece in a way that worked well. They talked about how they saved money, they improved user experience, they made things more efficient by doing that. And I'm like, to me, that's a perfect example of serverless. Why? Because they were able to build it and run it and have it in the wild and have it in front of customers working successfully for months, if not years, before they came to that realization. They learned that lesson. They had the time they needed to design something better. They designed it, they implemented it, they had deployed it, and it worked. Like, that's a tremendous success story to me for the serverless first approach.
Hey, it's very hard to argue with that. And you mentioned yourself like that you approach projects most of the time front to back, right? From the
Yep.
interfaces, then going to the back end, then to the service. And the serverless approach can cause more latency again if following your logic. So does anybody on the business side even notice, considering that Amazon, again, is a very nice example, right? It's a very complex, very intricate system where milliseconds of clicking make an impact, right?
Yeah, of
So
course.
I'm guessing there is no noticeable impact for the end user, regardless of what you choose, right?
There certainly can be. Again, from a business standpoint, the most important thing usually is get this thing in front of the customers as quickly as possible, right?
True.
We want to be in a situation where customers can give us money, where the customers can do the things they need to do as quickly as possible. And so that's another reason that I say, hey, serverless first, right? Because do the thing that's going to get me in front of people fastest. That's just part of my overall kind of UX first approach to designing software and building software. And I think that that works well with the serverless platform. But you are correct. You may end up in a situation where you are looking at metrics and you're like, these pages aren't loading well enough, or um, they're not able to get through this process fast enough. Take a look at that. Try to understand, is that happening because the serverless infrastructure is not able to respond fast enough? Or is there something else going on at play? Is it me not leveraging the platform well enough? So this is a great time to kind of explain that. I defined serverless in terms of serverless functions, but serverless is a lot more than just functions. You also have things like backends as a service. So one of the things that I use a lot is I do a lot of work in Google Cloud and Firebase. So I use the Cloud Firestore database. Cloud Firestore is a serverless database.
Hmm.
It has all the criteria, right? It scales as necessary. You only get charged for what you use. Um, and you don't have to manage any of the backend services behind it, right? I don't have to manage. I don't have to worry about hard disks running out of space when I'm using Cloud Firestore, right? Stuff like this. So Cloud Firestore is a fantastic serverless database. I've been using it for a long time, and so just understanding that I can have databases, I can have functions, I can have other types of services, auth services, really any type of rich feature that a platform wants to give us. Like Google Cloud provides a lot of things. There's a number of AI tools that are serverless endpoints that we can work with. Um, the same thing exists in AWS and Azure. So we are not being constrained with just individual functions in our serverless architecture. So part of what we need to look at is, have we selected the right services, or do we need to use different services? Have we selected the right database? Do we have the right data model to best leverage the strengths of this database versus its weaknesses? Do I need to, maybe the problem that I'm having is that I need to be multi-region, right? Because a lot of my users are in one specific region versus another region. And then I need to make sure that my data and my code is as close to them as possible. Maybe I can use CDNs or other types of architecture. So there's a lot of things that I can look at within a serverless ecosystem to fine tune performance and customer experience without having to go, oh no, I can't use serverless anymore. So I have a lot of options.
True, true. And I guess that speed and that efficiency cannot be beat for business, especially when you're starting up, when you're in an environment where you don't know whether to, focus on infrastructure in order to support your growth that is going to happen any second
Right.
now, and it does. Or, you
Right.
need to be safe and you need to save every single penny to invest into other parts of your startup, besides the infrastructure.
Right. And because one of the economic advantages of serverless for a startup company, for example, is that I've seen a lot of startups invest hundreds of thousands of dollars right up front in building that infrastructure before they have a single client.
I
Ouch.
think those days are
Uh,
past. It
I
feels
think
like
so,
in this
right?
market that does not work
I
anymore.
hope so. No, and like with serverless, I can build out infrastructure that costs me nothing until I start getting traffic, start getting people in there. It lets you kind of build a system. So for our parking startup that we did, the everything was designed so that the costs would scale with revenue. So
That's a
when we're
wonderful
caught
business
when
model.
we're spending money, yeah, we're making more money than we're spending, and it just tracks together beautifully. So it's a great way to build a business model, and you can do that when you don't have massive upfront costs just from the way you've designed your platform.
Yeah. If you succeed to design it correctly, sometimes platforms
Right.
pivot. Sometimes your
Yes.
requirements towards an infrastructure differ from when you
Absolutely.
started out. And you need that
Absolutely.
flexibility. And
And that flexibility, by the way, is another thing I like about serverless, because when you're designing serverless solutions, think of it like this. I think of serverless as kind of an opposite of a monolith. So when you are building a monolith, you doesn't matter. You don't have to think very carefully about where the different pieces are. You are building things that are tightly integrated. When you're building serverless, it's very modular. It's extremely modular. You're talking about functional units. You're talking about individual databases and services, and you're building this very modular, event-driven paradigm. And so a lot of times things are being connected in a very functional way based upon defined pre and post conditions, or based upon defined event interactions. That means that at any point in time, I can very easily choose to combine services in a way that makes sense. It's like, hey, this thing that I'm doing over here, this thing that I'm doing over here, they really need to be very tightly integrated. They need to happen concurrently. They need to work tight. closely together. I'm going to redesign this system so that those things are closer together. Or maybe these two functions need to be closer to this piece of code. I can really redesign my system like that very easily because it's very modular by default because it was serverless. If I were instead to start in a very monolithic kind of approach right out of the gate and have this very heavy infrastructure, and then I'm like, I need this one little piece to be able to scale independently of everything else or ramp up faster, whatever it might be. Now I'm in a situation where I need to extract that from a place where it's potentially been very tightly integrated. It's kind of like trying to untoss a salad once all the pieces have been mixed together. And so to me, I prefer very much going in with a very modular architecture from the get-go. You can always combine things when it makes sense and you know that you need to do it. It's very hard to separate things that have started that way.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Like that's where you get a very intermixed horrors of legacy being built on top of legacies, and then just being
Exactly.
impossible to untangle in the end. And then you just spend half your budgets for innovation actually maintaining stuff that was developed 20 years ago because you don't have a choice because you cannot stop the business now
Totally.
when it's been scaled up a little bit. So that's a very interesting point. I never actually looked at it that way, you know.
I
Yeah.
I saw somebody say something really interesting on Blue Sky yesterday that I've been thinking about a lot. He said, "Hey, as I get older as a developer, I feel less inclined to say that some code is good and some code is bad." Like, yeah, I kind of get that, but that feels a little bit wrong because I realized that I don't quite feel that same way. I used to feel like, well, this type of code is very good and this type of code is very bad. And I don't believe that anymore. I mean, code is code. It either does the job or it doesn't. But there is to me now today a definition of code that I consider good. And it is code that I can easily delete, right? Because one universal truth of all of our projects, think about agile methodologies, right? One universal truth is things will change, things will adapt. We are going to change our business model. We are going to need to improve our infrastructure. We're going to have to improve our code. We're going to have to make things faster. We're going to have to add features. Things are constantly changing. That to me is one of the things that makes hardware very, very complex, very challenging, but also very fun, is the fact that it is always changing. No project is ever static. This means that our good code that is code that can adapt easily. And to me, the best litmus test for adaptability is, can I delete this code easily without breaking other areas of my application? Because I'm probably going to need to do that. I'm going to need to replace it with a new implementation, or I'm going to replace one feature with another, or whatever that's going to look like. But I have to be able to be flexible. And to me, that's kind of the definition of good code. And when I'm in a very modular situation, when I'm in a situation where I can deploy functions separately from each other, it's incredibly easy for me to delete a function and either that service goes away or I can replace it with another one. But it's very easy to do when they're deployed individually.
So, you know, I'm torn between different things that I want to talk about. First and foremost, an off-topic mention that we have had our first Blue Sky mention on the podcast. Nice. I can see the brand is being developed very hard. I
Yeah,
can hear
totally.
more and more about Blue Sky. I don't know whether it's more towards Blue Sky or more towards how Twitter is positioning themselves. I'm sorry, X. But that's beside the point. What I wanted to ask is, I'm not a coder myself. I used to code when I was very, very little and never wrote a production line of code in my life because I understood very early that I am very much not an engineer. But as an engineer yourself, do you often see those situations where you can actually delete a piece of code and nothing breaks immediately? By breaks, I mean, of course, not just, in the moment, but the kind of the overall architecture survives the deletion.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a fundamental component of what we would call orthogonal architecture, where things are able to grow independently from each other. And so with very clearly defined interaction points. So when you are in an event-based model, or you're in a functional model where we have very clear pre and post conditions, if I remove a bit of code that depends upon a specific precondition, it stops producing that post condition. So anything downstream of it will break, but anything upstream from it will continue working exactly the way you would expect. So the thing that's important for us to understand is simply what is happening downstream, and do we care that those things don't happen anymore? If we don't care that they don't happen anymore, maybe that was the whole reason we wanted to delete the code in the first place. Fine, no problem. If we do still want those things to happen, then we will need to carefully consider what is the new way to go from the precondition to the post condition. How do we go from this state to this state? What is the code going to look like that's going to do that? But potentially, I'm okay with the time delay there, right? I'm going to delete the initial function, and a couple days later, I'm going to deploy a new function. The preconditions, assuming that they're in like a database or a data store, they're still going to be there. I can still process those. Okay. So 2 days later, I deploy the replacement function that's new and better, and it goes through and processes all those things that had happened, and it produces the outputs that we would expect. And it's amazing to me how often I find that like developers spend crazy amounts of time and money sometimes trying to hyper optimize functions and make them run as efficiently and fast as possible when it's not necessary. One example of this is we have a fairly slow piece to our um, parking application. So when a user is registering, one of the things we allow them to do is to take a photo of the vehicle and use that to register the vehicle. That photo needs to have part of the vehicle and the license plate in it. And from that, we send it to a third-party service that uses a trained AI, not large language models. We've been doing this for years, well before those were out there. But it uses a trained AI to feed back to us the make, model, color, license plate, what the state or country is that car is from, all these details, so that the user doesn't have to type them in. And that can take up to 10 seconds to do the round trip because it's this third-party API. Um, they're doing a lot of heavy lifting. They're sending us a lot of data. It takes a little bit of time. And it usually happens in a couple seconds, but I've seen round trips take 10 seconds. And normally you would say, I absolutely cannot use a service that would take 10 seconds in the middle of the user's process. But the problem actually isn't that the function is too slow. The problem would be that the process is poorly designed. So what we do is they take the photo, we upload it, and we immediately move on to the next step. We'll have them log in. Um, we'll have them submit their payment, whatever else. By the time they've entered their payment details and moved on to the finalized step of the process, their vehicle information has been loaded in, right? Take advantage of the fact that users can only move so fast. And so you just want to have the thing done by the time the user gets to the point that they actually need it. You don't necessarily need to make the user wait at the moment they gave you the information in the first place. So designing these types of processes is really important. So this is all event driven. The user takes a photo, we actually compress the photo to make things faster, and then we upload it. And then we move the user to the next step. In the meanwhile, behind the scenes, we have some code that triggers on the fact that, hey, this image just got uploaded. Now I need to do things with it. And that thing is going to be, I'm going to send it over to the third party. We're going to get this extra metadata. Then when I get all that back, that's a new event. The new event is I got the image back. Now I've got to respond to that. And that's going to involve combining that image with that metadata and updating the database record to reflect that new information. And so that's all happening kind of behind the scenes while the user's just doing their thing.
See, that's a very smart solution to a business solution to a technical problem. Usually it works the other way around.
Right.
But this example, I very much like. And this is what, your product managers, product owners can take note of as well in the serverless approach, where even if latency can become an issue, there are solutions that just mask that latency behind, a little bit of cleverness, so to
Yeah,
speak.
totally.
And we've talked a lot about examples of smaller companies and startups having that agility in the serverless approach. But we started off from talking about Amazon, and that's
Right.
nowhere near a small company anymore. So how about the big boys
Of
and the
course.
girls? What do they benefit from the serverless approach?
Well, I would like to point out that the most common things we talk about in serverless is Google Cloud, Amazon Web Services, and Microsoft Azure. 3 of the largest tech companies on the planet. They
Yep.
didn't create serverless for us. I mean, it's really that simple. Like, when you want to talk about big companies using serverless, the biggest companies using serverless are the ones providing serverless to us. Period. Why? Because it makes them all the benefits I mentioned. It makes them more agile when they can launch features without having to tie it directly to some of the infrastructure work they're doing. Obviously, these companies do massive infrastructure work. They probably employ most of the hardware people on the planet. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they want their service developers worrying about that stuff, because those are different skill sets. And other large companies, obviously, as well. There's always a use case, because companies are always creating new services, new things that they want to provide to their customers. They always have new projects going on, and honestly, there's a lot of times there's legacy upgrades happening. I mean, how many large companies have this perpetual cycle of trying to replace legacy platforms with new things? Those are all perfect opportunities to start injecting some serverless, and start detangling maybe some old monolithic types of structures, and maybe replace some of your massive infrastructure with lighter weight serverless. It's something that you can do as you're going on and still gain some really big benefits, regardless of the size of the company. I've seen it used at large companies as well. I think it's really valuable, and um, it's it's interesting to me, because I do sometimes hear in the industry, well, serverless is really this toy thing for startups. Not so much, not so much, because there's it's really easy to fall into the sunk cost fallacy, right? Where, because this big company has built out this massive infrastructure, it means we have to use this massive infrastructure for everything we build. But what is that going to mean over time if the company is successful? It means eventually that massive infrastructure is not big enough, ideally, right? And so there's always room for growth, always room to change and adapt.
Yeah, as long as you're not afraid of, outsourcing a large amount of your infrastructure to your direct competitors, which of course Google's, Amazon's, and Microsoft's don't really have that many competitors to speak of, but ideally they should, and then becomes a whole other issue. But that's more so, I think, even like a business strategy question rather than an infrastructure question
Absolutely.
of what kind
Absolutely.
of services do you trust overall, and so on and so
Oh, for
forth.
sure.
So that brings me to the secret that I know, that you have been to Berlin recently, and
Yes,
the event was called Serverless Architecture Conference, right?
that's correct. Yeah.
Cool. So, any insights, any notes maybe from the keynote of going serverless first, or the 7 years of serverless talk, or anything else that's worth mentioning?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd love to mention the conference. I started speaking at the Serverless Architecture Conference from the very first event in The Hague, Netherlands, in 2019. And since that point, I've been on the advisory board. So I really love the event. It's something I really believe in, and would love to have people show up and join us at the different events. I think the next event is in London uh, next spring. So The keynote I gave was very much about what we just talked about going serverless first, about making those decisions, about why I believe that companies can do well with serverless first. But the other thing that I talked about there, along with my partner here, is 7 years of serverless, which is basically talking about. I guess technically it's been 8 years now. It was 7 years when we came up with the talk title, uh, but it's what have we done over these 8 years? What are the different products and solutions that we've come up with? What are the things we've built on serverless in that period of time? And what's interesting about business is that we have primarily built serverless applications using um, Google Firebase. And so we've been doing that for the last 8 years just in this company. And so um, we talked about what are some of those things. We have the parking business. Sure, we've built that. That's really cool. But we also have a content management system that we've built on top of Google Firebase. So it sits on that database, and it is a very lightweight, serverless and headless content management system. So we have used that for, I don't even know, 2 dozen websites and applications to power those, to make it easy for people to come in and kind of change data and update things in real time. We have a gaming application we're working on. We have that went live this year. We're working with clients on a number of things. We built an application that would manage dental practices. We're building another application right now for buying and selling dental practices. It runs the gamut. And over the course of this time, between our products and our customers' products, we have seen millions of dollars of revenue flow through these serverless platforms that we've built, these products that we've built. And it's been super exciting and rewarding to see this really scale up, to see it be really successful in a lot of different types of applications. And we've learned a lot of things. There's a lot of differences to our approach now. Like I mentioned before, we kind of backed into serverless accidentally. We didn't set out to do serverless. Now we're very intentional about it. When we started doing serverless, we were picking out a few things at a time in terms of what services we wanted to use. We focused really heavily on a specific database. Now we pick our services right out of the gate. I want to use this database for sure. I want to have these cloud. I want to design it this way. I want to take advantage of these different types of events. And I'm really thinking right out of the gate, how do I want the pieces of this application to interact with each other? What are my pre and post conditions? How is this going to interact? How am I going to monitor this as it grows? All these types of things coming right out of the gate. Didn't do that initially. One of the things I've learned from using serverless databases, we use serverless databases directly from the client application. That's kind of how Firebase is intended to work. There's some advantages to that. We can use their SDK to monitor for database changes. What that means is that, and it can support up to 1 million concurrent users. So what that means is that I can have somebody writing data to the database, and within a few milliseconds, up to 1 million people that are watching that piece of data in the database get updated automatically in their application without me writing a single line of code, because the SDK handles that for me and the platform handles that for me. It's incredibly powerful. And so we take advantage of stuff like that. We build to that. And we are not afraid to have database code in the client. Whereas in a traditional architecture, you're imagining you have the database as the farthest thing in the back end, and then you have this API layer on top of this, then you have maybe these other layers on top of that, and then finally you get to the client, and that creates delay. And so I've talked about how can be latency in serverless, but for that specific use case, our serverless platform that we're using has much lower latency than almost any other backend that I've ever seen that would accomplish the same thing.
Oh, wow. Even that old daunty laptop that's been propped open with a sign on it that this is a server, do not touch it.
Don't laugh. One of my very first projects out of college was on a laptop like that.
Hey, but by all accounts and purposes, it probably still works. Maybe it's a very like load-bearing parts of a very, very strong and very high-performing load system.
Exactly.
So, yeah. Okay, what would you say then is the future? Is that laptop going to survive, or is serverless going to take us over and no systems administrators are going to be needed, or any infrastructure engineers are going to go on the wayside, and we're just going to be focusing on actually building the infrastructure rather than maintaining it?
Yeah, that's a great point. So what do I think the future is for serverless? I think that if you look back over the last few years, and again, this is something I talked about in Berlin. If you look at the Gartner hype cycle, serverless has been very, very hyped for a while. And then we hit the trough of disillusionment where people are like, oh man, serverless can't do everything. And now we're really hitting that plateau of everybody's using some serverless for some things. And then I say everybody very loosely, right? Because
Sure.
what you're seeing is there are some developers out there and some companies out there that maybe have heard of serverless, but really don't have the slightest idea what it is. And they've never touched it. And that's fine. But they're in a different part of the cycle than I'd say a lot of the industry, which is that they're fully aware of serverless. And at some level, they've figured out how they're going to use it. Now, I think there's plenty of room to adapt to that. I think that there's still room for growth there. So, one of the things that we're going to see change with serverless is hopefully we're going to see more and more companies adopt the serverless first model where they really lean heavily into building that way first. I do think that that's something that's going to take on in a lot of companies. It's not going to be all companies. And so it's hard sometimes to make industry-wide predictions when we see wildly diverse approaches to technology adoption within businesses. But I do think serverless is here to stay, but I don't know that it's going to be quite as much of a big deal because it's just a thing you're going to do. And we may eventually even stop calling it serverless.
Hmm.
I mean, the name might go away entirely. It's just going to be a concept at that point in time, right? We're going to find more and more. I talked about how there's exceptions where maybe serverless isn't going to fit. I feel like we're going to see more and more industry accepted almost patterns that say this is a non-serverless pattern, this is a serverless pattern. So when you run into these use cases, you're going to use this serverless approach. When you run into these use cases, you can use these other approaches. And we're going to start to see that mature a lot in terms of us defining, documenting, and recognizing those things in advance so that we don't have to figure them out on our own, right? And that's one of the interesting things about tech industry in general is we're still a new industry and the technology that's available to us changes so rapidly that it
Tell me
makes it
about it.
hard sometimes to mature as an industry, right? And to really develop, like if you look at other engineering disciplines, they have very regimented approaches to things, very clear definitions of how to solve problems. We've never had that, and I don't know if we'll ever have that in software because there are so many variables and factors that are sometimes changing in real time to be able to be quite that rigid. That's why we have these patterns, and I think that the pattern-based approach to engineering and software is going to continue to be a thing with serverless over time. I think that there's probably going to be we're going to continue to see new services happening. I think that the pricing model of serverless is going to stick around to a point, but you do eventually, where you only pay for what you use, but you do eventually run into situations where, just like anything else, sometimes you save money by buying in bulk, right? So sometimes it's cheaper just to buy a very large unit of capacity upfront. And so that's something that we're going to have to contend with in the serverless space to help companies mitigate costs when they have just a tremendous amount of traffic that would be too expensive in the serverless pricing model. Serverless is great if it scales down to zero, but if it's always running full tilt, it may be time for us to supplement that with some other options. Um, I do. I don't know. It's tough. I think we're going to stop spending quite as much time with it. We're going to see a lot more adoption of observability tools. We're going to start seeing a little bit more overlap between, actually maybe a little less overlap between DevOps and serverless. Because one of the things that's interesting is there's a lot of folks out there that are using serverless by using the serverless platforms provided by the big three, right? But you have other people out here doing what they call serverless by managing their own Docker containers and Kubernetes instances, right? Um, excuse me. That's something that is maybe a little bit different, and we are going to have to continue to decide what are we talking about. There's cloud native, there's serverless, there's wide variety of looking at how we consume infrastructure in the cloud. And we are even starting to see some companies moving away from the cloud. Maybe it's for security reasons, or maybe it's because of um, just needing to manage the movement of data a little bit more than they're able to do in their specific cloud provider. There's always things happening. And so I think that we're at the point where serverless has matured enough that it's time for us to really carefully consider architectural approaches just in general. And cloud is in a similar boat, right? Maybe cloud isn't perfect for everything. It is really good for a lot of things. So I think that very careful architecture, we're over the hype. Now it's time to be real. But I still believe very strongly in that serverless first. Build the thing that works, get it in front of users, and then very carefully consider how to build out your infrastructure now that you have a product.
I feel that that's a very interesting point that you brought up in the beginning is the state of maturity of the industry as a whole. I'm sure that, history will tell whether or not now is the time for that, but it feels like we are maturing, where the current situation with the downsizing and the race to replace engineers who were thought to be irreplaceable with many different approaches, AI being, of course, one of them, because again, the Gartner hype cycle chooses its target, and now it's going to be AI, and we're still on that
Yeah,
peak.
for sure.
Haven't been brought down just yet. And the solutions that survive, the tools that survive, the applications that are being implemented on the day-to-day are the ones that have proven themselves, are the ones that have been around for a while, where startups have used it, have risen to the top, maybe
Right.
even fallen since then, and has been adopted by the big players and is being used, and it just becomes the norm, like you said. So the
Right.
state of that industry is, we already have a few examples of that. We already have some technologies
Yes.
that were very much hype, and they have passed on and became the norm. And of course, we also had a bunch of different hypey stuff that did not survive the hype cycle and just kind of
Right.
quietly went away. So again, time will tell. But it
Yeah.
feels like we're at the juncture where specifically serverless applications and serverless technologies overall and building infrastructure with serverless in mind is a much more understandable and predictable situation for any business to
Yeah.
be in,
I think so. Yeah.
rather than, doing the same with AI, for example.
Yeah, AI is obviously AI is confounding to me because first of all, it's not AI, it's machine learning.
Yeah.
Machine learning has been around for decades, like decades. Large language models are specifically the thing that's new, mostly new, and they have things they're very good at and things they're very bad at. And so, just like with anything else, the important part as we go through the hype cycle for that is going to be correctly identifying what it's good at and what it's bad at and what it's efficient at, right? So one of the things that I care about very much when I'm looking at architecture, when I'm designing systems, when I'm looking at platforms and making tech decisions is what is my impact on the world? And part of that is looking at from a sustainability standpoint, or from kind of an ecological impact standpoint, right? How much electricity am I consuming? What does my carbon footprint look like for this? Am I doing things that are automating systems that might be oppressive or problematic for groups of people? And it's really important to me, as I'm building technology and making decisions about what types of things to use, that I consider all of that and try to make an informed decision that is going to put me in a situation where I am minimizing the bad impact and emphasizing the good impact of everything I build. And that is something that today is impossible with LLMs. And it's one of the reasons I have concerns about that approach right now. I think that serverless, on the other hand, is something that is going to be a lot easier over time to manage the carbon footprint, the ecology, the sustainability of those types of services, because they are very managed, measured, and understood. And because they can spin to zero, right? I'm not keeping a server running full tilt 24/7, regardless if I'm using it or not. And that's one of the many things that I like about that specific approach, for example. So these are kind of some of the decision making that I put into how to design something, how to approach something.
That makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. And it's a very interesting point again to talk about sustainability as a whole, and not just for LLMs, which is one of the main things that they're being criticized for. The other being that they stole everybody's data, basically. And
Right. For
yeah,
sure.
and you spoke a lot about, not a lot, but you've spoken about the personal impact that you have when designing, but there's also the massive impact of those particular corporations. And then the government steps in and tries to regulate all of this wonderful stuff. And I know that, the US is not too fond in regulation overall, but here in Europe, I think that things are moving a little bit faster in terms of regulating some industries and others as well, and maintaining a carbon neutral footprint, at least, or even a positive footprint, is one of the main important things that Europe tries to establish and support and promote. So regardless of the technologies that are hypey or not, and whether even they have an application or not, the government at some point is going to step in and tell us one way or the other where, serverless is okay. The energy spend that we have for serverless technologies, and for every single large corporation that uses serverless, they're fine. Running your own server for just, for fun? Probably not. Probably not. You're probably going to have so much tax going your way that you're going to reconsider it very many times.
For sure.
Hard to say, but I do feel like that just comes together in my mind,
No,
it makes sense.
I completely agree. And I would go along with what you just said and say that it's largely thanks to European regulation that the industry has matured at all, because we're not seeing the same level of pressure for maturation that in the US, right? So even down to business models, how they treat employees, how they make decisions about sustainability. Like, yeah, some companies are doing some of those things for good reputation, but a lot of them are doing these things specifically to meet regulation in Europe. So I think that that pressure is very good and has been much needed for the industry to continue improving. Like, one of the things that we've seen happen in the last few months is several companies have purchased their very own nuclear power plants just to provide the power necessary to power their LLMs. So
I read about that.
wow.
Yes. Insane.
I mean, obviously that's happening in the US. That couldn't happen in a lot of other parts of the world. So, wow.
Yeah.
It says a lot.
But we have some wonderful neighbors here in Europe that make us a bit uneasy. And we may be returning to nuclear power for different reasons than
Sure.
just pure business
Sure.
sense. And then we will have maybe a situation of power surplus, and then you kind of see what can we do with that extra energy? Maybe a few server farms, maybe can stimulate the business a little bit,
Totally.
provide the
And
infrastructure for up and coming companies.
absolutely. And you've touched on something. I'm just going to call it what it is, and that is that it's very important, especially when you are a leader in this industry, that you understand the impact that politics, global politics, have on the industry. I mean, you touched about it with the regulation and some of the other things that are going on in the world, but it matters a lot in terms of how the industry functions. And so, if you want to be a leader in this industry, you have to understand the global politics. You have to understand how they influence the industry, how the things that we're building are influencing the politics. I mean, look at social media, how that governs the flow of information. So we as technologists both have tremendous power to influence the world and also to some extent are at the mercy of the way things happen in the world and the mercy of politics. So we need to really be aware, be responsible, consider ethics in the things that we build, and try to use things that are providing the right level of impact on the world and on the people.
Yeah, yeah. Couldn't have said it better myself, honestly. And it's hard to predict how history will
Yeah.
turn out, but I feel like we are living in historical times, regardless of whether or not we can predict them. And the role of social media and politics and regulations and so on and so forth, we will feel maybe decades down the line, years definitely. But being aware and self-conscious in any position that you're in, even when building an infrastructure of your new product or and when revamping an old infrastructure of an existing company, keeping those things in mind is beneficial, I feel, to everybody around you and to yourself at the end of the day. And so when you're in that position, coming back to our questions, of course, um, if you're being a leader yourself, or what rather would be your advice to leaders that are currently in those positions of, the juncture of what kind of infrastructure to choose, or what kind of system to rebuild, and what to use as the basis for it, whether or not to consider
Mhm.
serverless as the crux of that infrastructure, or just go the old-fashioned way with the laptop.
Definitely don't use a laptop.
Okay, that's fine.
Um, make a decision based upon there's a lot of ways you can make decisions, right? One way you can make decisions is based upon your current team. What are the skill set of your current team? Now, at some point, you need to push your team to learn and adapt and grow, right? But it if your team is interested in something specific, if that's the thing they're excited about, it doesn't necessarily hurt to move in that direction. If they have deep skills and understanding in one specific area, maybe we go with that. Um, Too often, I see companies make technology decisions that don't fit their current team and then just replace the team. That's not a great way to do business, in my opinion. So do consider your team at least in a little bit in making these decisions, but also look at your environmental impact, look at the cost of doing business, look at how rapidly you're going to be able to grow and scale as things change. Um, Consider your ability to have disaster recovery, right? And so these are things. So one of the downsides that people look at with leveraging serverless options within a given provider is it really ties you to that provider. So I have two options. I can either, like just looking at Firebase, for example, I'm using the SDK to connect directly to backend services from a client application. And I can do that because I am absolutely integrated directly into that platform, which is great. It gives me a lot of advantages. But the downside is if they change something about that platform, or if the platform goes away, or if the platform goes down, I'm in trouble, right? And some companies absolutely do not have risk tolerance for that. in which case they're going to have to do something a little bit different. And then one of the things they can do differently is manage their own services at a higher level and then put them across, go multi-cloud, manage their own infrastructure. But if you manage your own infrastructure, here's the thing. A company I worked for a number of years has their own server room in their offices. What is the first obvious downside to that? One, if the internet goes down to them, then their servers go offline. And as much as they have two different internet providers, it is many times, I mean, if it's a storm or an earthquake or something like that, it's one building. What are the odds that all of the internet going to that building are going to go out at the same time? Fairly high. Power is another consideration, although you can solve that with on-site generators. But like at the end of the day, if that building goes down, if the building burns down, or a tornado or a hurricane or something takes that building out, their servers are gone. There's zero redundancy. So you got to consider this on the far extreme. You have your own servers that you manage in one location. That's not very good. So you always need some level of redundancy. So for smaller companies, I'm always going to argue that the cloud providers can provide more redundancy than you could ever afford to provide yourself, period. Even if you're in just one single provider. But for larger companies, you may need to think about other types of disaster recovery, either building the same thing in two completely different platforms. So one option is I can build something on Google Cloud and I can build something on AWS, and I can use load balancing, so you don't necessarily know which one you're going to get. And I've built that thing twice, but I'm fully leaning into the serverless platform and taking full advantage of it in both sides. And I can kind of balance load or do other ways of managing that. Or I can use Docker containers and Kubernetes to launch services and backends and deploy them across a wide range of clouds, right? But now I've got to do a lot higher level. I've got to do a lot more work. And I would argue that most companies, even most large enterprises, don't truly have the expertise to do that well. So you've got to think about that. Like you that's an investment if you want to do that well. You have to invest in the right people, the right skills to pull that off and make it work well. More than likely what you're going to do is maybe a managed services cloud, but still using more generic services so that it's a little bit more, you could provide in your software. You could do like an adapter layer in your software to kind of obfuscate which of those providers you're using. And so you could potentially make your software a little bit more portable that way. There's a lot of different approaches to this. There's a lot of different reasons any given company might want to be portable or not. When you're making these decisions, my approach is generally, unless there's a compelling business reason not to, take full advantage of the platform. It's there. It's amazing. It's wonderful. You can't outcode it without spending tons of money. So just own up to the fact that you're going to take on a little bit of risk by taking full advantage of a specific cloud provider services and connect straight into those services to get the full impact from them. If you can't do that, you've got to understand what is the business reason I can't do this, and am I willing to spend the hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars necessary to mitigate that risk? You have to do that eyes wide open and make that as a conscientious decision. You can't just say, well, I want to be multi-cloud, but it can't cost me anymore, because that is absolutely burying your head in the sand and refusing to accept the consequences of your decision. And usually, and this is something that's been bothering me for a long time, is I see technology directors and executives, and we see this with agile methodologies too, right? Where they want the upsides without the downsides of all of their decisions and kind of bury their head on the sand. And it's really, really, really important that tech leads push to educate and to promote this is what it's costing you, whether you're willing to see it right up front or not. It is expensive to go multi-cloud, very expensive. It's expensive in skills and personnel. It's expensive in the time it's going to take us to do it. It's going to cost you. It's going to potentially make it slower to do releases. It's going to have impacts on the business in a wide variety of ways. It doesn't mean don't do it. It means you have to, eyes wide open, understand what the implications to the business are, to the technology teams are. And one of the reasons we get here is that a lot of times people look at salaries as a cost I'm going to spend anyway, right? We don't look at it as an incremental cost to specific decisions. And to me, that's absolutely flawed, because if I'm going to spend somebody's salary on building 25 features over the course of a year versus spending their salary to do a fraction of a multi-cloud rollout, that's a massive difference in terms of the company's bottom line. One of those things is pushing this forward. The other is keeping the lights on, as it were. So we really need to, I think, be a little bit more sophisticated at how we break down the way things cost us. Traditional financial modeling doesn't necessarily lend to good decision making, which is why we end up in situations where companies will lay off thousands of workers and then hire thousands of workers in
Hmm.
close succession.
Yeah, but it will look good on a spreadsheet if you do it in different years, though.
Yeah, exactly. Kills me. I just, and that to me is a symptom of a flawed approach in how we constantly pursue profit above all else in some of our economies.
Yeah, but yeah, let's stop here. I think that's bordering on un-American to say something bad about profit-driven economies. So wait until you're in Europe. Let's talk it next time when you're this side of the Atlantic. Anyway, Michael, thank you very much for your insights into serverless. I feel much more educated than I was beforehand. And thank you all as well for listening to us. Please leave a like, share our video on YouTube, comment on it, and anywhere else outside of YouTube, feel free to subscribe to us as well. We are on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and maybe Blue Sky will be next, since, the brand is very, very close. Thank you for joining us. Have a nice rest of the day, the week, and the year, and make correct decisions with regulations and your impact in mind, and give serverless a go. See you next time.